On May 11th, 2024, this is the last picture Daniel Patterson would ever post on his Instagram. 2 short months earlier, I hiked this same trail to Everest Base Camp, crossed the same bridges, and saw the same breathtaking views he did. There's something eerie about knowing that the trail to Everest Base Camp has been the beginning of the end for so many climbers. The 2024 Everest climbing season brought with it moments of both shocking tragedies and fatal mistakes. Although fewer lives were lost in 2024 compared to the deadly toll of 2023, the mountain still claimed its share of souls. As we look back on this year's fateful expeditions, one thing becomes clear: Everest is a merciless predator, and for those who venture too close, the mountain can still deliver an unforgiving final sentence. These are the stories of those who never made it back. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On May 21st, 2024, Daniel Paul Patterson was on top of the world, literally. After months of preparation, the 40-year-old had finally done what he set out to do after he began training in the Himalayas a year ago, reaching the summit of Mount Everest. As he stood on the highest point on Earth, he must have felt excitement, happiness, and pure, overwhelming joy at his achievement. And he had every right to. It had not been an easy climb. The days leading up to that moment were anything but predictable. The weather had been shifting, and the window for a successful summit was closing rapidly. For days, Daniel had been forced to wait at base camp for the all-clear, a fact he wasn't too happy about. He even took to Instagram to express his frustration when on May 7th he wrote, "Waiting impatiently for a summit window." You can see the imposing Everest background in this picture. For Daniel, the frustration of staring at his goal but being unable to reach it must have felt unbearable. He watched other climbers who decided to push through the unpredictable weather windows, risking everything for the summit, and others who were coming back. But Daniel chose to wait, because this climb wasn't just another simple check off his bucket list. It was deeply personal. Daniel had come to Everest for more than just personal glory. His expedition was dedicated to a friend and gym member, Jenny Mutson, who had passed away from cancer a few months earlier. And while he expressed admiration for the logistical challenges of base camp, calling it a mini-city at 17,500 feet, bustling with porters, yaks, and helicopters, he certainly wasn't leaving without achieving his main goal, reaching the summit. After days of waiting, the weather was stable enough to satisfy the authorities. Daniel and other climbers finally got the all-clear to proceed. He was part of a 15-member team organized by 8K Expeditions, a well-respected organization from Nepal, known for guided treks on Everest and other major peaks. Alongside Daniel was a Sherpa guide called Patterson. He was only just 23, but he already had significant experience on Everest. Their climb itself was pretty uneventful. As a gym instructor and a co-owner of Wakefield CrossFit in the UK, Daniel was physically prepared to climb Everest. And on May 21st, 2024, at approximately 4:40 a.m., Daniel and his guide reached the peak of Mount Everest. He stood there and gathered his emotions to dedicate his climb to his friend. After that, the other half of his journey started, the descent. Daniel and his guide, along with other 8K group members, decided to start climbing down from the summit at around 7 a.m. You can't spend too much time at the summit of Everest. At 29,032 feet, the air is so thin that even with supplemental oxygen, your body slowly decays. Every second you spend at the top comes with a higher risk of altitude sickness, exhaustion, and conditions that are a lot worse. Because the weather was stable, the group must have felt confident about their chances of making it down safely. But the mountain had other ways of getting you. Daniel and Patterson descended very carefully. They knew that the ridge between the south summit and the Hillary Steppe had its dangerous drops and narrow paths. Daniel and a group of climbers were trying to cross the ridge when the ice cornice they were on collapsed under them. This happened in a flash. There was no way for them to see it coming. An ice cornice is an overhanging lip of snow and ice. They are some of the most dangerous features on Everest, because they are nearly impossible to predict. One moment the ground is solid and the next it's just not. They didn't have time to react. As the snow and ice beneath their feet fell away, Daniel and Pastenji, along with other climbers, were pulled into the void. The collapse happened so quickly that there was no chance to deploy their safety ropes or ice axes for a rest. But while other climbers merely fell harmlessly down a couple of feet and managed to regain their footing, both Daniel and Pastenji were swept off the ridge and right down into Kangshung Face, one of Everest's deadliest cliffs thousands of feet below. Several other climbers witnessed the collapse and immediately alerted rescue teams. Unfortunately, Everest's extreme conditions at those heights made rescue operations nearly impossible. Despite the rapid response, no sign of Patterson or Pastenji was found. The ice collapse was so sudden and so forceful that they likely had no chance to react or attempt any form of self-rescue. They just disappeared. The Sherpa community and trekking guides were in shock at what happened to the young man pass. Patterson's disappearance sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community and back home in the UK. His family, friends, and gym members launched an urgent plea for help, setting up a crowdfunding campaign to raise the significant funds needed for a specialized rescue operation. His partner, Bex Woodhead, shared emotional messages online, pleading for resources to continue the search. But as the days passed, hopes faded. The two had already spent more than a day in Everest's death zone, an area above 26,000 feet, where the air contains only 1/3 of the oxygen found at sea level. Experienced climbers know that even if they had somehow managed to survive the fall, their bodies would have been shutting down rapidly. Without immediate rescue within 24 hours, survival in such extreme conditions is nearly impossible. In the days following the accident, search teams, including Sherpa guides and rescue personnel, continued to comb the area, hoping at least to recover the bodies for closure, if nothing else. But despite the best efforts of those on the mountain, no trace of Daniel or Pastenji was found. After days of futile efforts, the search was called off. Daniel and Pastenji were officially classified as missing and presumed dead. In the aftermath of the tragedy, discussions about overcrowding on Everest resurfaced. Experienced climbers have long warned that the high number of people attempting the summit each year increases the risks for everyone. Patterson's group, which was part of a larger expedition organized by 8K Expeditions, had been climbing alongside many other teams, all pushing for the summit during the narrow weather window. Here's the dilemma. In such risky attempts, we feel safer in a big group. But it can result in overcrowding, which ruins the trail. Maybe it was the congestion, combined with the unpredictable conditions of the mountain, that contributed to the tragic outcome. With multiple teams all racing against the clock, maybe the ice was simply too fragile that day. I don't know. You can let me know what you think in the comments section. All I know is when you're on Everest, anything can turn a dream, like honoring a dear departed friend, into a nightmare. The mountain doesn't care about your reasons, your preparation, or your strength. It's just doing its thing. But Daniel was not the only climber with a dream that Everest took away in 2024. Like Daniel, our next story is about a seasoned mountaineer from Kenya who also faced Everest's brutal test. Imagine this. You're 60 feet from the summit. The world is behind you. The goal is ahead. Every breath is like a fire in your oxygen-deprived lungs. The snow crunches underfoot, and suddenly, everything goes dark. Like Daniel, Joshua was no physical amateur. He was just 40, in his prime as a mountain climber. And when it came to climbing experience, he had a long one. Joshua Chariot. Joshua was not just any climber. He was a corporate banker who never forgot his passion. Born on March 14, 1984 in Nairobi, Kenya, Joshua discovered his love for mountains as a teenager. The rugged landscapes of his homeland became his playground. His school trips to Mount Kenya planted the seeds of a passion that would define his life. By his early 20s, Joshua had already made a name for himself in the mountaineering community. His accomplishments were nothing short of extraordinary. He had summited Mount Kenya, his native country's highest peak, at over 17,000 feet, more than 20 times. On one remarkable occasion, he climbed it 3 times in a single day, while setting records along its most challenging routes. And his achievements didn't stop there. Joshua had also explored the Rwenzori Mountains and conquered Mount Stanley. If you remember my videos about Kilimanjaro, you'd probably be surprised to know that he ascended and descended Mount Kilimanjaro in just 15 hours. Very impressive, right? Joshua was always seeking the next challenge. In addition to mountaineering, he was an ultra-marathon runner, competing in races across the globe. One of them was in the Tour de Géant, a 205-mile race through the Italian Alps, which inspired him to write a book titled An Ultra-Marathon Story of the Tour de Géant. In 2023, Joshua made history by becoming the first African to summit Mount Manaslu, the world's 8th highest mountain, without supplemental oxygen. This incredible achievement was a testament to both his incredible physical conditioning and mental fortitude. That motivated him to set his sights on the ultimate prize, Mount Everest. Merely climbing Everest is a massive achievement for any mountaineer. But Joshua wanted to make his ascent truly special. He had a dream to be the first African to climb Everest without using supplemental oxygen. And for those who do not know, this is an incredibly difficult challenge. Climbing Everest without supplemental oxygen is a feat that has only been done by less than 2% of those who reach the summit. It is the ultimate test of a climber's endurance and resilience. Let me explain why this is special. At altitudes above 12,000 feet, the air becomes so thin that climbers often use supplemental oxygen to prevent severe hypoxia, which is a condition where the body doesn't get enough oxygen. Climbing Everest without supplemental oxygen is like running a marathon while breathing through a straw. The body begins to break apart rapidly, and every step becomes a huge effort. Climbing with supplemental oxygen would not be a big challenge. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel like I've achieved much, he said in an interview before the expedition. I want to see how my body can cope at such an altitude. If Joshua was successful, he would have been the first African ever to do so. This was supposed to be history, the first African to summit Everest without oxygen. But Everest has a way of rewriting history, brutally, suddenly. To prepare for his history-making climb, Joshua joined an expedition with 7 summit treks. Now, if you're even somewhat active in the Everest community, you would have probably heard their name once or twice, as they're a pretty standard expedition team. His plan was to climb through the southeast route through Nepal, following the usual acclimatization schedule. This involved multiple trips up the mountain, each time reaching a higher altitude, spending time there to adjust, and then descending back to base camp to rest. On May 9th, he posted a photo from one of his acclimatization trips with the caption, "Rotation 2 complete, feeling strong. Black don't crack. Onwards to Camp 2, where I spent a comfortable night. Day 2. Left camp too late. It's a hot day. Getting to Lotz's face, I finally start feeling that I'm climbing Everest, that Everest is indeed a big undertaking, with or without oxygen." On May 17, 2024, after 10 days at base camp, Joshua and his 7 Summit Treks team received the go-ahead to make their summit push. The weather was stable, the winds had died down, and the window was opening for climbers to make their attempts. Physically, he was confident. His rough training and previous high-altitude experiences had prepared him for this moment, but he still took no chances medically. Joshua had a history of high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, a life-threatening condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs. So for his climb, he carried medications like nifedipine to manage this risk. He was also prepared for high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, which causes swelling of the brain. To combat this, he had dexamethasone and acetazolamide in his medical kit. For emergencies, he and his Sherpa guide Nawang had a plan. Nawang would carry an emergency oxygen bottle. Joshua had set clear criteria for when to use it. If he lost consciousness, exhibited severe symptoms, faced unfavorable weather, or encountered insurmountable obstacles like traffic jams on the ascent. To simply say this, he was prepared. He had initially planned to climb from the less crowded Tibetan side, but circumstances led them to the busier southeast route. "Hopefully, we get to avoid the crowds," he said. Here is his last Instagram post, and as you can see here, his gear here was top-notch. He even joked in his caption about coping with the cost of the expedition. And so after heavy investment physically, mentally, time-wise, this expedition is taking more than a month from a regular 8 to 5 banker. Financially, the amount of zeros needed to make this happen means I declare bankruptcy immediately. I land back in Kenya. It's now the moment of truth. As usual, we reconvene here in a few days to see how things will have turned out. As the team began their ascent, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The weather, which is very unpredictable on Everest, was holding up, and Joshua was moving well. Along with his Sherpa guide, Nawang Sherpa, the team steadily advanced toward Camp 4, also known as the Death Zone, at 26,000 feet. This is where the body starts to break down. Oxygen levels become very low, and the human body begins to fight just to survive. Joshua was pushing himself to the absolute limit. For climbers attempting Everest without supplemental oxygen, the challenge is not just physical, but psychological. The thin air forces the body to work harder for every breath, and exhaustion creeps in faster than at lower altitudes. The mind, deprived of proper oxygen, can become foggy, leading to dangerous decision-making. But Joshua was determined. He had trained for this moment for years, and even as the air thinned, his resolve remained strong. Joshua and his guide soon reached Camp 4 safe and alive at around 26,000 feet. The climb from Camp 4 to the summit is the most dangerous part of the Everest experience, with sections like the balcony and the Hillary Step testing every climber's limits. Without supplemental oxygen, Joshua was facing an unimaginable battle that he knew was coming. His strength and determination carried him through the early stages of the final ascent, the start of the end. On May 22nd, Joshua and his guide set off from Camp 4. They aimed to reach the summit within the next 24 hours. This is where the details get a little fuzzy. No one quite knows what happened next, but as Joshua and Nawang pushed toward the summit, trouble began to unfold. Their last known position was at Bishop Rock, just 160 feet below the summit. At that point, Joshua was exhibiting abnormal behavior. According to Mingma Sherpa, chairman of 7 summit treks, Joshua refused to return or even consume the bottled oxygen reserved for emergencies. Back at the base camp, they lost contact with Nawang and Joshua. The last transmission was a garbled message that hinted at trouble, but provided no details. Rescue teams were dispatched, but the weather at such high altitudes made immediate rescues impossible. It took rescuers days to finally find Joshua's body in a crevasse, just 160 feet below the summit, so close to achieving his dream. Nawang was never found. He is presumed lost to the mountain he had guided so many to conquer. The news of Joshua's death sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community and his homeland. Tributes poured in from around the world. His schoolmate Shadrach Mwiratsi shared memories of Joshua's indomitable spirit. "He never settled for the ordinary," Shadrach recalled. "Joshua always pushed for more. He was a great guy who understood the risks, but was driven by a passion few could comprehend." Joshua's family faced an agonizing decision. Retrieving his body from such an altitude would be incredibly dangerous. After extensive consultations, they decided to let him rest where he fell. Retrieving his body from that high up would be risky for the rescue team, the family said in a statement. "We do not wish to endanger any life. Joshua had a deep love for the mountains, and they loved him in return. We find solace in knowing that he is resting in his happy place." Memorial services were held in Nairobi and his hometown of Cheptiret in the Rift Valley region. Friends, family, and fellow adventurers gathered to celebrate a life lived with courage and purpose. Joshua's story is a reminder of the thin line between ambition and risk in high-altitude mountaineering. His desire to push beyond conventional limits was both his greatest strength and ultimately his undoing. Yet he died pursuing his dream, and there are far worse ways to leave this world. I should probably state here that not all Everest expeditions in 2024 ended in tragedy. Positive records were also broken during this climbing season. One of the most notable achievements came from Nepali climber Kami Rita Sherpa, who reached the summit of Everest for a record-breaking 30th time on May 22, 2024. There were also several other record-breaking climbs. Polish climber Piotr Jerzy Krzyzewski made history by becoming the first person to summit both Everest and Lhotse without supplemental oxygen, completing the feat within an astonishing 1 day, 23 hours, and 22 minutes. But while some climbers set records and defied the odds, others weren't as fortunate. That's Everest. It's a whole world by itself. For some, Everest's unforgiving nature meant that even meticulous planning couldn't prevent disaster. This was the harsh reality for Usuk Jargal Tsedandamba and Purev Suren Lkagvajav, two determined climbers from Mongolia whose journey would end in tragedy rather than triumph. For Usuk Jargal and Purev Suren, Everest was more than just a goal. It was a calling. Their mission was not only personal, but also a matter of national pride. You see, these two men were part of a small but growing community of mountaineers trying to etch Mongolia's name into the legacy of Everest, to summit the tallest mountain in the world without supplemental oxygen and Sherpa support. That was something only a select few could boast about. For Usuk Jargal, this wasn't just about summiting another peak. At 31, he was among the youngest Mongolians to attempt Everest. His climbing partner, Purev Suren, though 53 years old, was just as determined. He had spent decades preparing for this moment. Both men were seasoned climbers, but Everest was an entirely different beast. Their expedition had been carefully planned for months. They had trained so hard in the unforgiving terrains of Mongolia, where the Altai Mountains stretched toward the sky. But the Himalayas are a different world. Everything is bigger, harsher, and far more dangerous. When the pair arrived at base camp in early May 2024, the mood was tense. The mountain had already taken lives last season. Weather patterns were erratic, and there was absolutely no form of entertainment allowed. But nothing was going to stop them. This was the ultimate challenge, to reach the summit without supplemental oxygen and without Sherpa guides, which is a feat attempted by very, very few climbers each year. For weeks, Usuk Jargal and Purev Suren followed the typical acclimatization schedule. They climbed up to Camp 1, then back down to base camp. Then, up to Camp 2, and back down again. Each rotation took them closer to their goal. Their bodies needed to adapt to the extreme conditions, the lack of oxygen, the freezing weather, and the brutal winds. By May 13, 2024, the two Mongolian climbers were ready to make their final push to the summit. Like many other climbers that season, they faced increasing pressure from the narrowing summit window. The weather was changing quickly, and this small window of clear skies was their only chance to complete their mission. There was no time for hesitation. The decision to attempt the summit without supplemental oxygen, as you already know, was incredibly risky. Not only did it test their physical limits, but it also put their lives in even greater jeopardy. Knowing the risks, Usuk Jargal and Purev Suren pressed on. By May 13, 2024, the weather had briefly stabilized, allowing the pair to begin their final push from Camp 4 to the summit. The duo started their ascent early in the morning. The summit was within reach, but by 8:54 a.m., they were spotted by a team from Tag, Nepal, that due to high winds, decided to turn back. Usuk Jargal and Purev Suren pressed on alone, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. Their climb was slow, the thin air and freezing temperatures taking their toll. At some point during their ascent, they finally resorted to using the supplemental oxygen bottles provided by 8K expeditions, even though they had set out with the ambitious goal of summiting without it. Their oxygen supplies were limited, and they knew they needed to conserve energy for the descent. By the time they reached the summit, they were completely exhausted. The photographs recovered from their phones later showed two climbers standing at the peak, holding the Mongolian flag. It was an incredible achievement, but the mountain's most dangerous challenge still lay ahead: the descent. As they began their descent, they encountered worsening weather conditions. The winds intensified, and temperatures dropped rapidly. Descending with little oxygen left, both climbers struggled to stay focused. Without radios, which they had mistakenly left behind at Camp 4, communication became impossible. Hours passed with no word from the pair, and by late afternoon, they were nowhere to be found. A search team from 8K Expeditions was immediately dispatched to try and locate them. But it wasn't until days later that they found their bodies in separate locations on the southeast ridge of Everest, the very path they had ascended only hours before. One had collapsed while trying to make it down. The other had caved into exhaustion and the merciless conditions of the descent. The mountain had stolen their triumph, turning it into tragedy. The recovery of their bodies was logistically challenging. The dangerous conditions and narrow weather windows made it nearly impossible to safely bring them down from such an extreme altitude. Out of respect for the climbers' families, the Sherpas retrieved their mobile phones, which contained their last summit photos. The phones were later sent to their families in Kathmandu for closure. These phones contained summit pictures that confirmed both climbers had reached the top of Everest, a bittersweet moment. Sherpa searchers eventually chose to move their bodies off the main route to ensure the safety of other climbers. Bringing the bodies down the mountain proved too dangerous, but it eventually happened on May 25th. Usuk Jargal was a father of 3 and one of Mongolia's most celebrated mountaineers. He was known not just for his strength, but for his deep connection to the mountains. He had spent years leading expeditions across the world, yet it was Everest that had always loomed large in his dreams. He had spoken many times about the honor of representing Mongolia at such heights. Purev Surin, too, had only recently begun climbing at this level. A talented and ambitious mountaineer, he followed Usuk Jargal's lead, probably inspired by his passion for the sport. Their bond had been one of mutual respect and admiration, a shared goal of bringing Mongolia into the global mountaineering spotlight. For those who knew them, the loss was devastating. Back home in Mongolia, their deaths hit hard. They had brought attention to the growing mountaineering community there. While these stories ended tragically, they're symbols of bravery. These climbers dared to dream, to push the boundaries of human endurance. And while Everest claimed their lives, it did not erase their legacy. They reached the top of the world. That much can never be taken from them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.